The Enlightenment can refer to a historical era between the late 17th and late 18th centuries. It can also refer to a set of ideas. How did these ideas gain traction during that era? What was the role of the press and free speech in the spread of these ideas? Why did the same people who advocated free thought and free speech also advocate free trade? And why do few people know that free trade was also an integral part of Enlightenment ideas? These are some of the questions which we discuss with my guest for this interview, Iona Italia. Iona received a PhD in literature for her work on the British literary scene of the Enlightenment era. The publication which she heads, Areo magazine, is a contemporary defender of Enlightenment ideas. So hi everyone, I'm delighted to be here with Iona Italia. Welcome back to the podcast, Iona.
Thank you, Vincent.
You are the editor-in-chief now of Areo magazine. You also host the podcast Two for Tea. You also are the author of two books. The first one was called Anxious Employment, published in 2005, and Our Tango World in 2018. Well, the first book was actually based, if I'm not mistaken, from your doctoral dissertation. So you obtained a PhD from the University of Cambridge in 1996. And the title of your dissertation was The Rise of Literary Journalism in the 18th Century, and then colon, Anxious Employment. Yeah, the book would be based on that. And this thesis was devoted to some, aspects or, some sub parts of the Enlightenment era. So, yeah, what is sometimes called, and here I'm sort of paraphrasing something that I found that you wrote, what is sometimes called the long 18th century. So the period from 1660 to 1780, this was your specialist area as an academic. Yeah, I mean, I guess, so I should say clearly for the audience, we're going to talk about the Enlightenment era and the Enlightenment ideas. And I mean, maybe I can ask first, what got you interested in studying this?
Oh, that's a really good question. So when I was an undergraduate, I particularly enjoyed the 18th century, the kind of pre-Romantic 18th century. People like Jonathan Swift, Alexander Pope, Henry Fielding. And I think what I really liked about that period was the wit and the irony and the understated nature of the way writers appeal to your emotions, but in a kind of indirect and understated way. And I felt it was a period that was very rich in humor, and also very the literature there was a freshness and newness to the prose. People were experimenting with a prose form, with a novel, not for the first time, but this was when the novel became the kind of prominent literary genres during this period. Previously, the most popular prose forms had been these epic romances that ran to many volumes, in which princes would go on a number of adventures and end up with a hand of the princess. And in the 18th century, there was a shift away from that interest in literature as chronicling the lives of aristocracy and heroes, and looking at ordinary, more domestic situations and ordinary people's lives. And ordinary people's lives are rich in comedy when they're closely observed. So that's what made me interested in that period of literature to begin with. And then I also, it felt like the first period in which things felt very, everybody feels this about their own period in literature, their own specialist period, but it felt like the first period to me when things felt recognizably modern and understandable. It felt like we've reached my epoch now, but nevertheless, it's distant enough in time and unusual enough that it feels it's not boring. I never wanted to do contemporary literature because I felt I live in the contemporary age anyway, and I can read that stuff anyway. That's what's surrounding me. And I would like to dip back into an earlier period. So that's how I became interested in the 18th century. And then among things that I was reading as an undergraduate were the Spectator and Tatler, the original Spectator and Tatler, which were these daily essay columns, basically, that came out in the first decade, in the 1700s, 17 teens, written by Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. And they were little pieces of social commentary, observations of certain trends, as we would call them now, and social phenomena, looked at from this just delightfully quirky, in this delightfully quirky manner, especially when it came to Steele's contributions. So I loved that genre, and I decided that I wanted to study that for my PhD. And originally, I wanted to look at, there are 5 periodicals of that kind, which were thought to have been written by women, edited by women. And they weren't most of them weren't weren't collections of different people's writing. They were less like what we would think of as a periodical and more like what we think of today as a Substack. They were like the first Substacks. And there are 5 of them which are thought to have been written by women or known to have been written by women. And I thought, well, this would make that's a really nice number for a PhD. 1 chapter on each and an introduction and conclusion. So my PhD began with that, and then I expanded it, and I decided I would do for each period, I centered it around the women's publications, but I compared each woman's publication with a man's publication from the same decade that was similar in some way. And that's what expanded out into the book.
Very interesting. And so this is not a prepared question, obviously, but why, sorry, not why, but what would you say were the main things that you noticed when comparing the works of those women with those of these men?
We should clarify, none of these are prepared comments. I'm just answering as best I can. What did I find most interesting, did you say, when I was comparing the works?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that I found a difference in the women's works in terms of the content or approach particularly. It was more that each pair of publications provided some fascinating contrasts. I think one thing that is many people don't know about 18th century writing is that, of course, a lot of writing was anonymous or pseudonymous, including women's writing, but also many men wrote under female pseudonyms. Of course, if you write under a male pseudonym, that may give you more gravitas, more authority. But if you write in certain genres which are more associated with women, if you write under a female pseudonym, people will expect a certain type of writing from you, and that may be the type of writing that they enjoy. So there were many, it used to be thought that there had been many, many more female novelists, for example, in the 18th century than there actually were, because we have discovered that a lot of the novels that were written as by a lady or by, and then there'd be some flowery lady's female pseudonym, were actually written by men who were trying to tap a market of people who were expecting a novel of manners of the kind that lady novelists were associated with. And some of the same things did happen in this kind of essayistic and journalistic writing, that some people chose female pseudonyms because of the novelty of it. It's like that the unusual thing about this is a lady is writing it, but it wasn't always a lady who was writing it. Yeah, gosh, it's been years since I worked on this stuff. It was one of the really interesting things was that most of these writers chose not just pseudonyms, but elaborate backstories for their pseudonyms, so entire fictional personae. And the full title of my PhD was actually Philosophers, Knights Errant, Coquettes, and Old Maids, because those were some of the pseudonyms that people chose. And in particular, I particularly enjoyed Charlotte Lennox wrote her periodical work under the pseudonym of Mary Singleton Spinster. And she called her publication The Old Maid. And it was, so I was really interested, among other things, in, because this was a very new genre. So journalism altogether, of all kinds, was very new, and had really only journalism as we know it, i.e. Unbound publications like magazines and newspapers and things that come out on a regular basis, as opposed to something like a pamphlet or a broadsheet that's published in response to a specific political event. These regular works of political and social commentary, the first ones didn't appear until the 1690s, so just before the start of the period that I was studying. And this was because of the lapse of the Licensing Act. So up until 1694, so in 1644, I think it's 44, they issued a licensing act and John Milton famously wrote a piece, Areo, which was arguing against the establishment of this licensing act. And Areo magazine, which I edit, was Malhar Mali, our founder, called the magazine Areo after Areopagitica, which was Milton's plea for a free press. And he, the Licensing Act meant that the Crown had a monopoly on printing. And during that period, there were only 4 printing presses in operation. And also everything that was printed was liable to pre-publication censorship. So this is the act which Milton opposed, and despite his opposition, it went through. And that act was allowed to lapse in 1694 when it came up for renewal. And that meant that
so we're talking, just to clarify for the audience, we are talking about the United Kingdom here.
Yes, yes, sorry. We are.
Mhm.
We're talking about the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
Although there really weren't any regular periodicals much before 1690 outside the UK either. After the Act lapsed, of course, first of all, now there was no pre-publication censorship. You could be prosecuted for what you had written for various things, for obscenity and libel and um, sedition and things afterwards. It wasn't a free
Mhm.
speech idyll, but nevertheless, things were not read beforehand. And
Mhm.
not only that, but now there was no monopoly on printing presses. So anybody could set up a printing press and start printing. And in those 40 years, there'd also been um, considerable advances in technology, which meant that it was also easier and faster to print things. And so lots of people set up printing presses and started printing and selling books. Once your press is up and running, it's very easy and economical to just print out a few loose pages as well and send them off as a regular thing, as a kind of money-making thing. In between, while you're waiting to see whether you'll have books ready, you can just get a periodical out every day or every week. And so suddenly there was an absolute explosion in the number of periodicals, newspapers, and magazines. Um, so those are that was a very new kind of genre, and it was interesting to see how writers saw their kind of role as commentators, and part of that was the identities they chose for themselves and the pseudonyms. So I did look at the content as well, but I wasn't so much interested in reporting as how did people conceive of this whole enterprise of journalism, and so how did they comment about what they were doing?
To give a broader context, I mean, when people think about the Enlightenment, at least I think one thinks about the context of well, the monarchy, the divine rights of kings, and there were already John Locke's work in the wake of
Yeah.
the wars of religion, where he said that one should be more tolerant of other people. Um, so I'm wondering, and so it was a context where there was still, strong monarchies in the UK and on the continent. The Enlightenment ideas spread throughout the population. This is something that you also, I think, discussed, that people were going to cafes and they were picking up those newspapers which you were just discussing, and they were discussing among themselves. Yeah, can you say this a bit more about this?
Yeah, I guess so. I think when I think about enlightenment, there are several things. There's the period of history that we usually associate with the Enlightenment, which on the continent began earlier, but in England we associate it with exactly this period, the kind of long 18th century, as academics call it. So from 1660, when that was the Glorious Revolution, which meant that the deposition of the of James the reestablishment of the monarchy after the English Civil War, and the from 1660 through to the Romantic period, which for us is in the 1780s. We think of that as the Enlightenment in the UK. And obviously, not everybody in the Enlightenment period was enlightened. Um, and religion and religious authority and superstition and authoritarianism were also still around. And of course, also some of the major figures from the Enlightenment still had some authoritarian or superstitious or non-rational beliefs. So it obviously wasn't a monolith. And there were, of course, also many ideas were developed during that period, not all of which we would now think of as enlightened. But the reasons why we think of it as the Enlightenment period in the UK have largely to do with the emphasis, two things, I think, the emphasis on free thought and the emphasis on free trade, which were linked. And the free thought emphasis, there was a general questioning of knowledge that was produced by fiat, by authority. So there was the growth of deism, which was the idea that of a kind of non-interventionist God. There was the increasing interest in human psychology. There was increasing interest in economics, i.e. how do human systems work, examining people's behaviors and drawing conclusions from those, looking at child development, rather than taking your knowledge from authority, from Aristotle or from the Bible or from the proclamations of the king. And part of that kind of flourishing of knowledge was definitely facilitated by the rise of these periodical publications, because reading, it's much, books were still relatively expensive and still relatively rare compared to nowadays. Although the 18th century was the first period in which people began really complaining that there were just too many books, that too much stuff was published. That had never been the case before. Up until this period and the explosion of printing, people had complained that bad books were published. People have always said, certain things shouldn't have been published. A lot of trash is published, but no one had ever said there are just too many books, there's just too much stuff, full stop. And that became a kind of trope in the 18th century, that was just too much stuff. And there weren't enough bums to wipe to use the paper for, in the kind of satirical thing. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who is one of the writers I studied, told the poet Alexander Pope, when he announced the publication of one of his books, his new epic poems, "I'm glad you'll write, 'twill furnish paper when I shite." This kind of idea that there was just a proliferation of stuff, that was new in the 18th century. But also the newspapers and periodicals were light and portable and inexpensive and very much reusable. And there was a huge growth in, especially in London and later in the Scottish, in Edinburgh and Glasgow as well. There was a huge growth in coffee and tea houses, especially coffee houses, where you could go in and men could go in and pay a small amount of money and have their coffee and read the periodicals, which would be lying around there on the tables for the use of patrons. So it's been estimated that each periodical had between 20 and 30 readers. And that furnished material for discussion. And also for the first time, people could write into periodicals. And periodicals could publish your comments and your questions anonymously. So that also gave people a possibility of impacting the discourse in the public sphere that they hadn't had before.
The position that the Enlightenment emphasized, on the one hand, free thoughts, and on the other, free trades. And I think, the idea that free thought was a key tenet, so to say, or a key aspect of the Enlightenment will be a surprise to no one. I mean, people have learned that, that this was what the Enlightenment was about, mostly, that people started thinking about, especially what religious authorities were claiming to know. So some of those writers were saying, well, how do you know that what you're saying is true and there is no reason to believe in that? And why do you claim to tell people how they should live, what they should think, how they should pray, and so on and so forth. I think this is well understood, hopefully, by my audience. So the free trade aspect, I have to say, it's become familiar to me for several years now. But I'm curious to see and hear what you think. Certainly, I would say in France, if you would go to some people on the street and tell them free trade was one of the key points of the Enlightenment, they would be very surprised. I don't think many people have heard of this. It's not emphasized at all in my experience. Is it something that, I'm talking when you study like in high school or middle school, at the level of education that everyone possesses. This is not something you hear in France. And I'm wondering, I mean, is it something that is more familiar to people, maybe in the UK or elsewhere?
Oh, I really don't know. Actually, I didn't do so. We specialize very early at school, and I didn't. We narrow down the subjects that we take at age 13 or 14, or at least we used to when I was at school, which, I'm 52, so I was at school in the 1970s. So things could have completely changed since then. But I didn't do history actually as at school. I didn't study any history until university. And so I'm not really sure what the curriculum is.
Okay, let's say then, I think you've lived in many different countries, it's fair to say, from what I know. And I'm curious I mean, maybe you don't know, but do you think that if you sort of talk to people, or if you're able to know what's knowledge or belief they might have about the Enlightenment, do you think that one of the first things they will sort of talk about or think about is free trade?
Well, I've noticed that some of the more woke, quote unquote, types I clash with a bit on Twitter do think of it as associated with free trade, but in a quite negative way, because of course, one of the most profitable trades was slavery. And one of the kind of less rational parts of the Enlightenment was people doing some quite nasty pseudo-race, pseudoscience, which was designed to provide an ad hoc, post hoc justification for slavery because it was so profitable. But I think that, I mean, of course, the Enlightenment didn't invent slavery. Well, I think that the free trade, you mentioned the wars of religion before, and one of the things is that if you have religious tolerance, if you have to have trade, you need peace, and if you have trade, that is also that also gives you an incentive to be at peace. So two nations that aren't at war can trade with each other to their mutual profit. And if you have religious tolerance, then you can also, the religious people who were debarred from certain professions can now be allowed into certain professions, and you can end up with a more kind of profitable, quote unquote, citizenry. And I think that the shift also, I talked a little bit about the shift from an interest in the exploits of heroes and princes and princesses to an interest in domestic life. And that went along with a greater kind of valorization of tradespeople and a greater interest in trade. And so I would say that this shift from the most important thing is people's religious beliefs and religious practices, which, you know, trade has always been important, but in many periods of history, what was kind of considered the most important thing about human life was people's belief and how they lived out those beliefs. Early societies were mostly theocracies or de facto theocracies. And in the 18th century, that kind of that enthusiasm for theocracy broke down completely. And what you have instead as the basis of society is economics. I don't know if I'm making sense here, but I think that it's, I think all of those things are closely related. And suddenly it was tradespeople who people were writing about. One little example, which I think might be useful to think about, is that attitudes towards dueling. One little kind of historical side note that during the 16th and 17th centuries, if somebody insulted your honor, you challenged them to a duel, and that was considered the noble and correct thing to do. And in the 18th century, there was a gradual shift in people's views on this. And in fact, Joseph Addison, who is one of the first writers who I read when I was doing my undergraduate, who is one of the essayists who sparked my interest in that topic, wrote about this quite a lot, about the evils of dueling. And it became seen as something kind of thuggish. And that
You mean
was
the dueling?
The dueling was, it was no longer, it's not noble to fight in duels anymore. It's the action of a thug. And so there was this shift from proving your worth by through your noble blood, your inherited authority, to proving your worth through your prosperity and your economic contributions. And that's a shift which obviously has kind of continued to the present day.
Yeah, fair enough.
Has its disadvantages too, of course, but so I would say that that's part of what made free trade so important.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's many more things to say, I think, about this. You know, I mean, this aspects of the Enlightenment, which is the emphasis on free trade, and how, in my view, certainly in France, it's been completely forgotten or very much put in the background in the meantime. I mean, we can go back to this, but in the meantime, I also wanted to mention, you know, in the at the turn of the 20th century, very much to your point about the shift from, you know, the stories centered on heroes and knights and whatever to the ones centered on maybe more ordinary life. There's this book by the German writer Sombart, Heroes and Merchants, which actually lamented this. He was one of the many German sort of reactionary counter-Enlightenment writers of the era, and he was, yeah, I mean, lamenting this because, you know, commerce and, you know, shopkeeping, so to say, is easily seen as a mediocre activity when you compare it to the heroics of soldiers and whatnot. And this is I think it's a recurring also sort of tendency that humans have to see commerce as this self-interested, petty, mediocre activity, whereas actually it tends to increase the well-being of most people around, but it's something one easily loses track of. Yeah, so in on the continent, I mean, I know you studied mostly the UK Enlightenment, but in France, certainly we see the Enlightenment as, you know, impossible to entangle, certainly in the popular imagination from the French Revolution. It's seen as kind of the culmination of the Enlightenment, which, I mean, there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, from what I know, and I'm curious to see what you think. But also, one of the main inspirations of some of the revolutionaries was the works of Rousseau, who was certainly not an Enlightenment writer. I mean, it's been discussed. Probably this book, Counter-Enlightenments by Graham Garrard, perhaps?
No, I don't.
Okay. So this is where I learned mostly that, unlike, I would say, what we are implicitly taught in France, Rousseau was really, I mean, he turned against the Enlightenment at some point early in his career and was kind of an opponent. After a while, he was more advocating, he also wanted political transformation, which inspired some of the revolutionaries, but it was not towards more freedom, but rather towards more sort of deliberate order imposed from the top down, with a more modern sort of outlook and philosophy than the monarchy, but still something very authoritarian, one would say. I don't know. I mean, did you at any point study or take an interest in this relationship between the Enlightenment, the French Revolution?
So I did teach. I did teach for the what we called the Romantics, Rebels, and Revolutionaries period, which was about 1780 to 1830, from a completely British point of view. So I taught Paine, and I taught Thomas Paine's work, and also Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, which is, even though I am really not a conservative by temperament, Burke is one of my favorite writers, and I absolutely adore that book. I think that so I think of, I guess, Rousseau, the revolutionaries, and other movements of this kind as being, the problem is there is not enlightenment versus non-enlightenment, but it's utopianism. And there's really two ways of thinking. There's a kind of gradualist way of thinking, which is we work with things as they currently are in human nature as it currently is, and we look for incremental changes. And I think that that way of thinking became, for whatever reasons, that way of thinking became the kind of chief way of thinking within the UK Enlightenment. And I think also because we had a much less extreme system and much less extreme inequality and dictatorial. We didn't have such dictatorial overlords as you had in France in the same period. And I think that and the roots of that go all the way back to Henry VIII's break from the Catholic Church and things. But we won't get too. Let's not get too off track. But the kind of incremental way of thinking became the more influential way of thinking within the UK. So Locke's thought is Locke stuff is incremental. He's in a treatise concerning human understanding, for example, he says, let's look at the way in which children learn. How can we use that to improve our knowledge of society and our understanding of society? And we have Mandeville and later Adam Smith talking about economics, and economics is also an incrementalist system. It's small incentives affecting the behavior of many people. And it's an attempt to study kind of human behavior under certain incentives and punishments. Whereas utopianism is this kind of belief that you can change the system all at once from the ground up, that you can revolutionize things. And that kind of thought, well, first of all, it never ever works. It always ends up requiring extremely authoritarian measures to implement. And that's, I think that every utopian scheme has the kind of seeds of its authoritarian nightmare already there inbuilt.
Yeah, there is this tendency, I think, the difference between the British sort of outlook and well, the way it happened in France, I guess. But you know, I think there was divergence among the revolutionaries in France, and some wants to go further than the others. And from what I understand, those who had the more utopian or sort of all the way mentality were more inspired by Rousseau than the, you know, actual, so to say, Enlightenment writers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, Rousseau was a utopian. He thought you could, for example, he thought you could train up the perfect wife. You could just adopt a young woman and kind of mold her into what you wanted her to be. That's utopian thinking. The idea of that from outside you can mold and control human nature. It doesn't work.
Yeah, and I mean, after that, in Germany, where I am now, actually, there was a long period of an intellectual life, well, mostly dominated by opposition to the Enlightenment. I mean, one can point to exceptions like Kant to some extent, and a few others, Feuerbach maybe, but broadly and generally, I mean, even Nietzsche, I mean, not initially, but during some short period, was very enthusiastic, you know, towards Voltaire and other things. But yeah, in general, German thought was very hostile to the Enlightenment. I think, I mean, it's not, I think, I know that some of those writers, especially in the early 19th century, were saying that the Enlightenment is maybe good enough for the French and the British, but surely not a proper German thing. And, you know, there was this, I mean, you know, one can correlate it with the political evolution of Germany. And on the intellectual side, it sort of culminated, you can say, in the works of Heidegger, which is probably the most hostile thinker in the 20th century to the Enlightenment. But, you know, it's very recent and considered one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century by many people, extremely hostile to reason and, you know, science and sort of the idea that people can understand one another across sort of identity or national borders.
I don't know anything about German philosophy,
Okay.
Um, and I didn't study German literature at all. Of course, I have read some German literature. I mean, I happen to be reading a biography of Thomas Mann at the moment, and I'm quite surprised to find I've read all of Mann's novels, but I've never investigated his biography in any detail.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm surprised to find in his work, particularly before the First World War, he wrote a nonfiction, really terrible nonfiction kind of political commentary on the German situation, and I think it's partly inevitable because of his own background in a trading family in Lübeck, and his kind of I would say ambivalence about the values of sort of trade, that he has this very, very romantic notion of a kind of intrinsic German spirit, which is resistant to modernity and unique and incompatible with that of other nations, and has its own interests separate from those of other nations. Here's the opposite of trade, the kind of the nation with its inimicable interests. So, in a sense, warfare is the opposite of trade. Warfare is the zero-sum game, and trade is the mutually beneficial gain. And it's, although Mann, of course, later became an opponent of the Nazis, it's very much the philosophy that it's very much one of the philosophies the Nazis ran with. I'm not a fan.
Yeah, I mean, it very much matches what I think was the dominant way of thinking during this, one could call it the long 19th century, this 1789 to 1939 in Germany. And, I mean, for the most recent of those thinkers, Heidegger in particular, these were key inspirations for postmodernism, which maybe can bring us back to the present, and also to this sort of contemporary, positioning regarding the Enlightenment. When you mentioned earlier that, some contemporary academics, or I don't know, activists, it's usually difficult to tell the difference these days, just condemn the Enlightenment wholesale by saying it was the source of slavery, etc. I mean, one can also mention, and should probably, the book by Steven Pinker, Enlightenment Now. It's also a book which defends what it presents as the legacy of the Enlightenment, and it does include the virtues of free trade in this legacy, for sure. And it angered many people on the left, I guess you could say, intellectuals. And I mean, I think that besides maybe the vanguard of sort of academics who say that, well, they don't really necessarily say it outright, but in practice they do reject the Enlightenment, or they do accuse it of many evils. So it's not only that they reject, like the capitalism aspect, they may sort of accuse it of being guilty of all the European conquests of the world and all that came with it. And they don't even care that much about, the Enlightenment's fight against, religious authority and theocracy. And this is something that is not really a factor in this picture. But so besides this, maybe more, yeah, vanguard's extreme position, I think there is kind of a rear guard and more common position among left intellectuals, which is to say and think that they really are the inheritors of the Enlightenment. I mean, certainly in France, because of the revolution, mostly there is this thing, there is this idea that the Enlightenment and the left are, inseparable. You cannot consider that the left is against the Enlightenment. And since, the left has become for a very long time now mostly opposed to free trade, there was this forgetting of the free trade aspect of the Enlightenment. And I think most people who are, okay, they like the end of the monarchy and the theocracy, but they don't care for free trades, see themselves as heirs of the Enlightenment. And so they were very angry to see that Pinker also reminds everyone that, sort of free trade allowed for the decrease of poverty, right? A strong decrease of poverty rates and mortality, illness, and so on and so forth. This is, it's a disputed legacy among intellectuals, that of the Enlightenment.
It's interesting. I think, I can't remember who it is who said this about democracy. I think it might have, I want to say it was E.M. Forster, but I'm also pretty sure that's wrong. But who said democracy is the worst of all possible political systems except for all the others. And I feel less about democracy that way than I do about capitalism. Capitalism is the worst of all possible systems except for all of the others. I'm not an economic libertarian, so I do believe in safety nets. I don't believe in equality, i.e., I don't think equality is achievable, and the efforts to try to achieve it are extremely destructive. So this is utopianism again. It's not possible to have equality, but I think it is possible to prevent most people from being in absolutely abject poverty and very bad circumstances. There will always be some exceptions. There will always be, because people have the freedom to make catastrophic mistakes. And also you have some people with mental health difficulties that just aren't easily compensatable for, who are going to get into trouble, no matter how much you help them. So, but for the majority of people, I think we can provide a minimal standard of kind of comfort. And I think that so I am a strong supporter of the welfare state, but for wealth generation, you need capitalism, and also to incentivize people, to incentivize research and development and innovation, you need capitalism. There's no other alternative, and it's much better than war.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, yeah. So do you think this is also something you've noticed? That, I mean, I think, I'm taking this book as a reference because I think it sort of drove people to state their position on the Enlightenment and its legacy and how they want to embrace it or reject it or whatever. But I mean, for sure, in the English-speaking world, there are these critical theorists who want to sort of position themselves wholly against it. I mean, they are not even just critical theorists, but let's just say for the ease of the terminology. But do you think you've also seen people who told Pinker, well, no, this what you're saying, what you're praising is not the Enlightenment. It's all this, techno capitalism, unhinged progress. I mean, I think you understand the sort of reaction I'm thinking about, right?
Yeah. I think so. I mean, like Pinker, I describe myself as a Pinkerian optimist. So I am in favor of technology and progress. Um, but I think there are several things going on here. One is that Pinker is not a historian. And when he is talking about the Enlightenment, he's talking about the central Enlightenment ideas and values, which and things that happened in the period didn't always further those ideas and values, and not everybody who lived in that period who was a prominent thinker in that period was a kind of Enlightenment thinker, quote unquote, in that sense. So some historians have got really tied up in knots over Pinker kind of playing fast and loose with history. And I that's a fair critique, but this is not a history book. It's to talk about it as the Enlightenment is at the very least a really useful shorthand for a set of ideas that we all recognize. The other thing I would say is that academics love to complicate narratives. So as soon as you have, and this is not just something that is a legacy of the postmodernists, but in general, if you tell an academic that there's one clear through line of story here, that just immediately sets their hackles, gets their hackles up. So I think it's inevitable that if you have if the book feels like a grand narrative, and this really feels like a grand narrative, his book, then that is going to come under criticism. I'm actually surprised Yuval Noah Harari hasn't had more flack for his book, which I think that his books are much more questionable in their assumptions than Pinker's. But also I like Harari, but it's this sense of the one grand idea that will explain everything. And that, of course, never works, and you can always poke holes in any narrative of that kind. And that's one thing that academics do kind of professionally. It's the thing I think that I was most effectively trained in at undergraduate level, which was before I went to university, if something was in a book, there it was on the shelf in a big fat book by a kind of well-known author or respected author, then it must be true. And so I remember this dizzying sensation of reading one huge overarching explanation for things after another. And each time I would read the book and I was completely convinced by the argument within it. And then I picked up the next book and the argument was completely different. I was also totally convinced. And it wasn't until undergraduate life when we got kind of trained in questioning people's narratives. And I really realized that just because something is published in a book doesn't mean it must be true, even if it's a renowned and well-known author, etc. That these are all approximations and attempts to get at a strand of the truth. At best, they're a strand. So I think that that impulse, when you're faced with something that very ambitious assertions, you go on the attack. That I understand, and I think that's actually a legitimate kind of purpose for academics and a legitimately good result of academic training. What I don't like is the personal attacks and personal cancellations and stuff. But I think Samuel Johnson, who is my sort of hero talking of Enlightenment figures, said that he who writes may be considered a kind of general challenger. He meant like when you're jousting, in the jousting ring, you can ride up on your horse, and instead of challenging a specific person to joust, you throw your glove down into the ring and anybody can come up and fight with you. And that's what you do when you publish something. You ride your horse into the ring, you throw down your glove, and you're like, fight me. And it's quite legitimate to fight. That's a productive way of doing things. What I don't like is this idea that you can't be wrong without being evil. Pinker's book could be completely wrong and his ideas could be totally wrong, but that wouldn't necessarily mean there was anything wrong with him or there was anything wrong with exploring those ideas. Wrong doesn't equal pernicious, and that's one of the things that really annoys me in current discourse.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's true that it's prominent in current discourse, but I'm afraid it's kind of an inbuilt feature of human life.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I haven't read Harare's books, so I cannot comment, but I think what drew the ire of many people is they didn't like that Pinker is saying that things are going pretty well, things are doing better than before, because it seems to me that this is the reason. The thing is, it shows complacency with current problems, and it's sort of an argument for not doing anything, which Pinker explicitly stated is absolutely not what he's saying. But I think many people still sort of read that through what he was saying.
Yeah, I think that's also, I do have some sympathy for that viewpoint, because I think that although from a kind of purely rational perspective, saying things are better than they were is not an argument that they can't get even better, or it's not an argument for not changing things that remain bad, or solving new problems that have arisen that weren't there in the past, which is something that Pinker doesn't talk about at all in the book. Nevertheless, really, if you want to mobilize and motivate people towards improving society, you never start from things are pretty good actually and much better than they were. So the psychology of this is all wrong, and I think that there is a real danger of encouraging complacency, and it's not enough to just say that your wish is not to encourage complacency, because it's so it's a kind of inbuilt danger to that approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if one has a realistic picture of human psychology, I mean, if one's goal is to, effect change, then I would tend to agree with you. With a realistic, which means sort of pessimistic, probably, picture of human psychology. Yeah, I mean, one could argue that Pinker's point is more to describe what has already happened and say, just, this is how it is. I'm not saying how to proceed next, but I mean, fair enough. I take your points.
Yeah. I also haven't been through the footnotes and all of that, so I don't know. There have been some criticisms of the scholarship, the sources of data and things like that, and there are myriad footnotes, so I don't know how conscientious versus sloppy Pinker is with those things, but I think there can't be any doubt that his general argument is correct, his general assessment is correct. I did feel slightly it's possible that there are, individual details are wrong, and since the kind of weight of details is used to make his argument, that could be problematic. So I don't know, I can't, because I didn't check any footnotes and I didn't look up any data. But I don't think anybody could possibly claim that the book is incorrect in its general thrust.
It's I mean, we've got a long way since the early 18th century, but I mean, how much do you really see the legacy? I mean, I think it's I understand that you do see it, but how much and in what way do you see the legacy of those let's say early 18th century writers in the world transformations that have happened since, which include those, sort of technological advances and rise out of poverty of, I mean, billions of people, really.
I think so. I think it's very hard to pinpoint the legacy of any individual writer. It's incremental and kind of it's a snowball effect of more and more of those ideas being out there, and more people finding them sensible and agreeing, etc. And in general, in these issues where it's about changing the general tenor of ideas and discourse, it's a long, slow drip effect, and with many temporary reversals. So it's one of the criticisms that people make of free speech is that the marketplace of ideas surely doesn't work because we see bad ideas gaining traction all the time. And sometimes bad ideas really being extremely influential in changing the course of world history for the worse. So we were talking about the Nazis earlier. And that certainly is true when you're looking locally and temporarily. But when you take a really big picture view, there has been enormous progress to me, in human ethics and understanding. But you have to take a very big picture and long-term view. And I can see why that's, if you want to change things, then you don't start from that view. You start from where are the problems, and therefore we look to the problems. Part of the issue, I think, for me, is less that this focus on the problematic elements than kind of being determined to find the problems in specific areas. So you're determined that there must be, for example, the problem must be racism, or it must be racism here locally, or it must be prejudice against this, or must be prejudice against that. There are plenty of very, very serious issues to tackle, but the issues won't necessarily, if you're not willing to first do the work of trying to find out how things actually are before you decide how you want to remedy things, then you're going to get into all kinds of trouble. So you need to begin by a clear-eyed assessment of what the reality of things, what the reality is. And there's a lot of tendency to ignore real problems and invent fake ones, which are easier to solve.
Yeah. I mean, now we're living through an era of, also development of new media. You could say sort of like during the Enlightenment with digital media. And there are many worries, as you were hinting at, that many bad ideas, even dangerously bad ideas, are spreading fast and successfully. Yeah, I mean, do you think there's a parallel with what had happened then? Well, I mean, were there many also stupid ideas that were being publicized at the time, and how, if so, how did things then evolve?
Were there many stupid ideas that were being publicized at the time?
I mean by these new newspapers, newly developing newspapers.
I would say, in general, no. So I want to really exonerate the newspapers that I know from that. I would say that I mean, there was certainly some clinging on to conservative ideas, and there was also some factionalism, some of which was very, very destructive, some political factionalism and polarization that was fed by the early essayists. But was there kind of spreading of new and newly pernicious ideas? Not in the people who I studied. No, I can't think of any example.
I understand that, not in those writers, but I was thinking, maybe these new forms of media could have helped, the spread of, I mean, very false ideas. But if it's not the case, then that's fine.
I can't think. I can't think of an example from the period.
Okay.
I can. There was a huge amount of. This isn't an example. It's kind of a counterexample, but there was a lot of panic about the novel in particular, which was also a new form in that period, and people believed that. They believed, first of all, that the novel was such an immersive, addictive experience that it would just cause people to waste all of their time. And much like Twitter today, although I think it's much more true of Twitter, but they would be just absorbed in reading a novel and would forget their duties and would forget their work and their families, and women would neglect their children, etc., because they would be just sitting there enthralled reading novels, which seems to us now like an idyll, doesn't it? So many people enthralled in novels that they forgot themselves. And there was also a fear that it would lead to a great deal of discontent because people would be reading about, in particular, women would be reading about love stories, and it would lead them to feel discontent with their own relationships, and they would end up either being seduced by some Lothario or just running off and leaving their husband and children. I think that although our kind of fears don't take that form anymore, people do still have similar fears about, for example, the discontent that could come from browsing Instagram and seeing only people's beautifully curated versions of their lives, their highlight reels, and feeling discontented with one's own life or with one's own appearance because everybody looks great in their bikinis, or whatever it might be, So I think there's a kind of similarity there. And there was also a lot of fear about the power of the imagination and the ability of what you can imagine to sort of shape what you might do. Or there were beliefs that if you were reading about murderers and evil people, that would cause more crime and would cause more murder. And none of those things really came to pass. And I would say that the the press, the Enlightenment press, was an overwhelmingly positive social force. And in a few very, there are a few very famous influential cases, such as the North Britain number 45. That was a paper, an essay that became influential during the American Revolution, that was a plea for the revolutionaries. And I very much agree with Christopher Hitchens' view that the ideals of the American Revolution were one of the best things to come out of the Enlightenment. Influenced by Enlightenment thought was the same ideals that they took up in the French Revolution, but done in a better and a less utopian, more incrementalist form. And the British press was actually, of course, there were many newspapers arguing against the colonists, but everybody already had that idea. What was new and revolutionary were the ideas in their favor. So I think that the press in that period were overwhelmingly positive as an influence on contemporary thought.
Fair enough. So would you then draw a contrast to the current era?
I don't know. So I think that I really don't know. I mean, it's like saying the question is too general. It's like saying, are women good people or something? Or
yeah.
Are the French a good thing? Or, you know, it's there is such a wealth of there are so many bad newspapers out there, and there's so many bad examples of, let's say, speech in the public sphere, and there's so many good examples of speech in the public sphere.
Yeah, but I mean specifically maybe, you know, the development of new forms of media, so digital media, social media.
Yeah, I think that the real problem with so I think that as far as the content of what's on social media is concerned, I would say that's a net positive. So the spreading of knowledge, which will also naturally include the spreading of some things that aren't knowledge, that are misinformation, etc. But the effects of that greater openness are net positive. I think that the main negatives are the main negatives are the thrusting of ordinary people into a whirlwind of negative publicity. So the possibility of viral videos and stuff like that, and deep fakes are going to make that. I don't know if the deep fakes thing is going to make that worse or better, because on the one hand, deep fakes will mean anybody can create a video of you shouting racist abuse at people, and that could lead to a furore of anger on Twitter. But on the other hand, if deep fakes are common enough that everybody knows that it's very likely to be a deep fake, you might be able to get away with actually shouting racist abuse at people because you have plausible deniability. Like, that's not me, it's just fake. You know?
I would predict that if there is a content that shows you doing something bad, people who already dislike you will decide that it's actual genuine content. This is really you, and people who already like you will just say that it's fake. I would bet some money on that.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that is part of the problem. and certainly a huge problem at the moment. And I think that also, we have these tiny snapshots of people's lives, which are little clips of videos or photos or tweets. So it can be things that they've said, even things they've said that are stupid or bad. But it's just like one teeny tiny little bit of their lives, and we're using those to condemn them globally. And people's entire lives are being ruined sometimes as a result of this. That's one big problem. But I think the biggest problem is the kind of addictive nature of the social media for most people. And that's something that just does not seem to have an easy technological solution. I interviewed actually Nir Eyal, who's written a book, Indestructible, on this, and he has really researched all the possible solutions, but none of his solutions really work. He says, well, you can just install this app, which will limit your Twitter time, but with one click, you can like uninstall the app, So you can put a few more stages, a few more hurdles between yourself and the platform. And doing that will tend to fuck up your phone or computer systems because they're very resistant to those hurdles. But in the end, you have this highly addictive medium at your fingertips all the time. And the real problem, I think, is the tendency to live too much online and not enough in the real world. That worries me much more than any specific content.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, still in this contemporary era, which aspects of the Enlightenment do you see as most either needed or relevant, or something like that? And maybe not just which aspects, but maybe in which places, or in which sort of sectors of human life.
I would say that tolerance of difference of opinion is the big one. And of course, during the actual historical Enlightenment period, they weren't always role models in this. This was a period in which in the UK, for example, Catholics, Jews and dissenters, so people who weren't members of the Anglican Church, were not allowed to hold official office or enter the professions, medicine and law, or get a university degree. So they weren't ideal, but the principle is the important thing here. And I think also remembering that belief is not voluntary. So if somebody thinks or believes something, they are not a bad person for thinking or believing that thing, because you can't help what you believe. I can't make myself believe that the moon is made of green cheese, however good it would be a thing to do. And this is also what I think religious and devout religious people often don't seem to understand or acknowledge, that you can't just simply will yourself to think something or believe something. And so I think tolerance of difference of opinion is the big one. And also, I think not respecting authority is important, but I would include that you have to be careful not to reject established authority in favor of setting up some kind of voluntary micro authority.
Right. I was going to say something like that. Yes. Because it seems that these days many people have decided that, okay, you shouldn't trust the powers that be, but you can just trust yourself first of all, and just other people whom you see as somehow
you definitely
very
can't trust
trustworthy.
Yourself. You're the last person you can trust.
Yeah, definitely.
But you have to keep a sense of general fallibility.
Right. Yes, very much so. Um, yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, I actually didn't really use my questions much because the conversation was very fluid, and so we just talked, which was very nice. Is there something else that you would like to add?
No, I'd like to really encourage people to read Areo, and if you can, to subscribe to our Patreon, because here's my little my little Areo spiel. It's very important to um, keep a number of publications that are leftist but with a more liberal slant, and are more open to diversity of ideas and allow people to think aloud, and potentially be wrong, rather than just rehearsing an orthodox line.
Yeah.
And our publication is very much welcome to everybody who shares those kinds of values. And we are complete. We don't have, unlike almost all the other publications out there, we don't have we don't have a board of directors. We don't have billionaire funding. We don't have any form of private funding. We're completely independent, and we're completely independent of founders, and we are dependent on readers' support. We are dependent on people supporting us through our Patreon. We have Subscribestar, and you can also, if you prefer, give a regular monthly PayPal donation. So please join us.
Yeah, I can also join in the recommendation. It's one of my favorite magazines to read, and
Thank you.
I definitely recommend that people go check it out. It's very often very interesting articles there. Okay, so thanks very much, Iona, for this very interesting conversation.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Liberté Académique. We are a science, critical thinking, and freedom podcast. We interview researchers, teachers, and authors who have interesting ideas and who defend free, rational, evidence-based thought. We oppose as best we can a sort of anti-intellectualism coming from a section of the intellectual class. We carry out interviews in English and in French. You can find all our episodes on YouTube and on SoundCloud, as well as on the main podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, and several others. We are also present on Twitter at @CatFreedom and also on Facebook.